Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today is going to be a long one, so I'm going to try to make this intro fast. Because it's long, there will be no bonus content at the end, but I would still appreciate you joining and subscribing to the Engineering Politics Locals community. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com and become a member for free, or get a subscriber pass for as little as $2 per month. Or you can use promo code EPFREE for 3 months of the subscriber pass free. That's spelled EPFREE. I'll go over more of where you can find me and support this content after the show. Today I'm talking with another special guest, although he is hardly a guest anymore. You know him, you love him, it's Truman from Return to Reason. Today is yet another episode where he just knocks it out of the park, and honestly, I'm just along for the ride, although I hope I added something useful during the conversation. You can find Truman and his locals community at returntoreason.locals.com. If you like the Engineering Politics Locals community, you will love the Return to Reason Locals community as well, so go check them out. Today we continue our conversation on hierarchies and how they've changed in a strange way recently. This is our longest recorded conversation yet, but I assure you it's worth the listen. Alright, let's get this started. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.
All right, we are recording. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Having another conversation here. Kevin and I are going to be talking about a lot of stuff. So, Kevin, I don't know how long we were kind of prepping for this, especially if you count our conversation the other day, but we've really been talking about what we want to talk about in this video, I think for maybe a total of 3 to 4 hours between two different conversations. So we're going to be going over I think a lot. We're going to be maybe introducing a lot and then trying to be very specific in what we're introducing here. And the way, what I told you earlier is I see this as maybe a bit of an introduction to a topic that I think is super important. I know that you think is super important and it has some overlap with some stuff we've talked about in the past. But we're trying to kind of introduce an idea and the ramifications and kind of what we would do about it, here in this video. So if you want to kind of just start us off with just generally what we've talked about before and what we're going to be talking about today a little bit. Like I said, it was funny. So for those of you guys listening or watching, at the end of when we were just kind of brainstorming, I said, so what do you see as the bookend here? And Kevin was like, I kind of see this and I kind of see this, but I don't really know where we're going to end up, but I like it that way. And I'm like, dude, I totally agree. So we both kind of have a general, like where we were kind of synced up, a little bit in the various angles with this topic, but we have no idea where this is really going to end up, but we kind of know a little bit of the starting point. So Kevin, I'll kick it over to you to kind of give us a thought on or introduce this, and then we'll go from there, man.
Yeah, I think we're going to take what we have been discussing before this conversation, the whole 5 hours we took to talk about it.
I'm going to interrupt
you. Absolutely.
Hey, I'm going to let you finish, Taylor. So my ice is totally melted. Whenever Kevin and I first started talking, I completely filled this glass with ice, and I poured the rest of my honey whiskey in. And my ice is totally melted. That's how long we were talking before this. So 5 hours.
I had a full beer when we started.
You had a Guinness. Do you want to go get it? Do you want to go refill it before we get started here, man? You probably should.
No, because I have I have gout. I'm not 80 years old or anything like that, but both my parents had that. So if I drink more than one beer now, my foot starts to extreme pain. So it sucks. But this was not a Guinness. This is the left-handed milk stout, nitro. I love it. And this is a different different glass. I mean, we have 1 billion breweries just in the Madison area, and this is the working man that we stole from some brewery somewhere.
Okay.
So
you should switch to whiskey would be my takeaway.
I might. If there's some weird random cutout during the middle of this thing, it's just because I grab some whiskey.
I'm cool with it. All right. Let's do it.
All right. So, so what I think would be useful picking up on is where we left off in one of the last podcasts. We kind of do these things where we discuss a little bit at the beginning, but it is really thinking through ideas in real time. And because of that, we hit on a couple of topics that would be awesome to flesh out now. So one of the things that we hit on was a Jordan Peterson conversation that I couldn't find, and now you found it. So hopefully we can link that. I'll be linking it somewhere on my locals and stuff like that, because a great conversation where Jordan goes through the differences, especially in the context of the American left and right and the European left and right. And there's an important difference, because the American left and right is like there's policy prescribed to those positions rather than the actual behavior within those two different political ideologies. And we're free market on the right, no abortion on the right, more religious freedom at least on the right. And in the European context, being an older society, they don't break it down that way. Well, one, like the free market isn't really like a thing anywhere there. It's like, what brand of socialism do you want from the left or right? So it's not really broken down to policy as much, but behavior. And one of those behaviors manifests in a way that goes through hierarchies. So hierarchies are these things that are maintained in human and animal behavior, that you want to build a hierarchy if you want some sort of positive net outcome for society. So I like to break it down in sports. It's like, I'm on a football team. We got 1 second to go. We're on the goal line. We're not going to like spread out the ball so we have some sort of fair, equal outcome where everyone gets to have a touchdown. No, we find out who's the best player on the team. We give that guy the ball, and we hope he gets it in the end zone. And because he gets it in the end zone, everyone on that team, everyone in that hierarchy has now won the game, because the person at the top of the hierarchy did his job. So that's the way, we built a hierarchy there. It's a competence hierarchy. And the way I phrased it in an earlier conversation was close, but not totally accurate. I said the right is there to maintain hierarchies and the left is there to break them down. That's way too simplistic, and I don't want to get in this mode where I'm just trying to figure out different ways to knock on the left because I'm of the right. That's not the way we should try to break this down. So I think the best way to put it is the left looks at these hierarchies and tries to basically represent the people at the bottom or the people on the outside of the hierarchy. And they see these hierarchies as becoming corrupt when the benefits of that hierarchy don't spread out to society or spread out to everyone in that hierarchy. But when those benefits start to creep up and they only hit the top of the hierarchy, then the left is like, this has become rigid, this has become corrupt, we got to break it down, or we got to rethink it, we got to do something to it that's going to now, make it more useful to society. And that throughout history has been an extraordinarily useful and in fact, very, very important function of the left. So that's where we started off there. I wanted to make sure that they're not just there to break everything down, but we're starting to see it change a little bit. And that theme is still correct here, that we're starting to see a change, but it's more than just in this one broad hierarchy. The problem with, bringing up hierarchies in general is you got to explain to what context are you bringing this in? Because there are several different sub hierarchies, I would say, in a different hierarchy to society, but the behaviors that are within the hierarchies are now changing. I mean, you're starting to see this one group emerge that has changed, kind of like what you said, and you probably can explain it better than me, but just within that political ideology of the left, there's been a hierarchy flip, a hierarchical inversion, like, if you will, where now these people at the top of that hierarchy are starting to make these demands, and a lot of the people in the top of the hierarchy are in the top of just the broader hierarchy, where it's the people at the top that are starting to reject the hierarchy that they're in. And that's a really, really strange dynamic. Normally, historically, it's like the people at the top wanted to keep going because they're the ones who benefit the most. But now you see these massive personality. You have LeBron James saying it's things aren't fair for him, even though he's sitting there, the embodiment of someone who came from nothing and was able to climb the hierarchy and maintains himself on the top. But he's completely rejecting basically that happened and trying to say, it's not your fault or not everyone's fault that they're at the bottom because, there are some racial things at play or some, external force within the system that is tamping it down. And I think what we need to do here today is kind of flush out what does that hierarchy idea mean? And really, if we can really figure out how it is manifesting itself in our society, then we can begin to understand how to break it down or how to change it to make things get back more toward normal. Because right now it's pure chaos, and we need to inject some order in the chaos. And although it is good to have a bit of both, you need to have both order and chaos. And me as a conservative, we're so orderly that if we inject no chaos, it's the same thing as the hierarchy. It starts to become rigid and corrupt. When we are just all order, our voices just get shut down, as well they should be, because there's nothing new. We're not bringing anything new to the discourse, and it's very important to inject the chaos. But right now, we got to have a little bit of order.
Okay, so that's good. Can I tighten up a few of the things that you just said, or maybe add a little bit? So whenever you're talking about how in the West, so what you'd say is, Europe and North America, is Western, has a unique set of, values and everything that's under attack right now. And that's okay. That's not what we're talking about right now yet. But so hierarchies exist, like you were talking about achieving a goal with I like the football analogy, right? So hierarchies exist within that to achieve a goal. And the way Peterson introduced it was, it's not just to achieve a goal, like to do something, what you would say maybe is silly and unnecessary, like in football, although depending on if the Chiefs are playing or not, I would argue that it's not silly and not unnecessary for them to achieve their goals. But the point is it was to solve problems, to do things that benefit the group, right? And so the sports analogy, it's you get it into the end zone and get a touchdown and your team wins. But practically in society, that can look like electricity and everyone getting electricity. It can look like building roads. It can look like grouping together and forming law enforcement, with something like that to protect each other. So the hierarchies are a natural function of the fact that life is riddled with problems, and humans are much better at solving those problems together than they are separate. And whenever they get together and tackle a problem, a hierarchy naturally emerges based on who is best at implementing the solution and how the spoils are divvied up, right? So in that football analogy again, so whenever the Chiefs won the Super Bowl this last year, everyone got a ring, right? Not just Patrick Mahomes. But the way hierarchies can bend towards, as you said, rigidity or corruption is whenever they only start to benefit those at the top of the hierarchy. So in that same example, it'd be like if only Pat Mahomes and all the starters got rings and people that were on the practice squad and stuff like didn't get anything. It was, they're just chopped liver. So that's whenever the hierarchy starts to become corrupt, is whenever it's not benefiting every person who is supposed to be benefiting from it. So again, in a practical sense, humans get together, we create a hierarchy again. So let's go to the law enforcement thing. And you say, well, the police don't answer the phone if you call and you live in this neighborhood. They don't answer, or you can't even call them. Then that's a corrupt hierarchy, because now the law enforcement that everyone's taxes are going into only benefits people in this one area. So then it's become corrupt. But they arise in relationship to problems, and then over time, hey, what's up? And then over time, as more and more problems are solved, then we start to come up with different games and different things that we're going to do, right? And that's where football and other things come in. And I think that's an important point to make at some other point, and as we're figuring this out, but is the fact that we now have hierarchies that are not dedicated to problem solving. Hierarchies might organically arise from solving collective problems, but what if there are no collective problems that will help you create a hierarchy to gain power? Well, then you have to fabricate some problems. And so, but that's another part that we might not necessarily get into right here, but I think it's an important point, is the ways in which they arise organically and what we might say now is an inorganic hierarchy that operates more parasitically. So, okay, so going back to what you said about how they, you talked a little bit about the left and the right here. Okay, so I'd like to flesh out, so that the observation that you made whenever we talked about this, that I've kind of hounded you on, of like, Kevin, we got to talk more about this because I really like it. I think it's a great observation. So let's just flesh that part out initially. So the claim that Peterson made, and then I've got those slides we can use if you want. I've got that little picture I just made on my phone, whatever. But whatever it looks like to tease out that specific idea of how hierarchies have what you would say historically operated and the people who have historically had certain roles within our greater society. And we can get into the overall framework as well. I think that's an important point. But can you tease that part out of what exactly are we talking about here? What's the Peterson reference? What's the observation you made that I think is really, really good? And let's tease that part out a little bit. And again, we've got those slides I can throw up, whatever you want to do here.
Yeah, so the original observation really was that the hierarchy that we've had, the competence hierarchy, has been completely flipped upside down. And there's almost like a hierarchy replacing it. And we've the traditional left that is now in control. They're at the top. They're the top of the competence hierarchy, at least, in this scenario. And you have the right that is either at the bottom or completely shut out. And since they don't have that traditional role of being able to break that down or being able to even identify the hierarchies and figure out how to break it down and make a less rigid hierarchy, there's no good response coming from the right now. So I still believe that to be kind of true. And we've talked about this before, but it's not necessarily that the right doesn't know what to do and to break down a hierarchy. It's they didn't try building much of an infrastructure to do it. I mean, we would say the left in the U.S. has been building it for years in institutions like university and mainstream media and all news publications, where they have this infrastructure where they can shout, whatever they want, #BLM on all of these things. And the right has no response, not necessarily because they don't have no response. They have no microphone for that response. They're not able to speak to the top of the hierarchy because, like we've talked about in past podcasts, you have that Overton window issue where the window is wide open as long as you're talking in the right direction. But if you're talking the other direction, that window is so small you can't get anything through it. So there's this unequal feedback now coming up to the top of this new or reformed hierarchy that is not allowing us to say, hey, there's something wrong here. Hey, this is corrupt. Hey, we should really stop doing this because all you're doing is rebranding racism in most cases, and you're weaponizing it now. And although we're trying to still play within the same bounds of this game, that the maybe not a great of a game in this context, but at least the principles of the West that we try to operate in, you have the people at the top of the hierarchy that are not only operating in the system that those principles help create that hierarchy, they're also trying to puncture through and trying to expose these new principles that you don't normally see in the West, and that they're trying to kind of, I would say, keep that to maintain their position up there. So they're trying to accomplish a lot of different things. And it's just not something we've really seen much in the past. And the reaction to it is so poor, again, because a lot of it's coming from the right who don't have the infrastructure, and a lot of it is just people are scared to push back because they know that Overton window is small and they're going to get rejected.
Okay. All right. So I just had a thought, as always. I don't know if it's a good one, but I worry that we maybe should have started a little bit with the stakes a little bit more. So I'm like, okay, everything you're saying makes sense to me. I assume at least most of what I'm saying makes sense to you. Very rarely do I think what I'm saying makes sense to me, but as long as it makes sense to other people, that's fine. But I wonder if maybe we should put a pin in this and go back to, why should anyone give a crap about what we're talking about right now in the first place? So we're talking about these hierarchies and the West and all these other things. And you and I both know, so like I said, we've spent a lot of time kind of syncing up on this off camera of, this is super important. And this is something that we really, really want people to understand and have some buy-in to. And so I worry that we might need to flush that out a little bit and then come back to, we can have a placeholder here at, okay, so the left and the right are currently occupying places that are historically different than they did within hierarchies. There's some corruption taking place. There is a means of giving feedback within the hierarchy that has been changed and altered, like you said, puncturing of the general system. So those are some things that I do want to talk about, but maybe we should kind of put a placeholder here and go back and tell people a little bit of why we think this is important. Like, why are we bringing up some of these some of these things here. And like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to kind of put that, so if we can put that right back here for a second and put on the forefront, like, okay, hey guys, let's take a step back and say why we think this is important. Just thinking about like some of those metaphors we used earlier of like captives and people in different situations. Like in your words, like why is this something that people should even care about in the first place? Like why should people even still be watching now, let alone not have shut it off within the first 30 seconds?
Yeah. I mean, one, it affects everyone. So there's big kind of this idea that kind of the libertarian idea, like just let those people rage, and I'm not worried about them right now because they don't have any power. And now they're starting to get this power, and you're starting to see it. So kind of the analogies we were making earlier is references to different movies that were like hostage situations where the hostage takers come in, you're in a bad spot, but it's like you're not feeling immediate danger yet. Then all of a sudden they start getting closer to you and making demands of the group you're in, and then all of a sudden you're starting to have guns swung in your face, and then you have a decision to make. At that point where you start to feel the actual danger, you have decisions to make. And not doing anything in that situation might not be the worst, but it's not great. And now you're getting pressure from the person, with the gun in your face saying, well, the equivalence to your silence is violence kind of movement, where it's like, okay, now I really can't. Now it really looks bad if I don't say anything. So what the hostage taker wants is for you to comply. And complying might be the easiest route at that time and might, save your life for a little bit. But in the end, it's going to hurt. It's not going to end up well for you if you just comply. Also, not going to end up great for you if you just say nothing. But the hardest thing to do, but really the sometimes the best thing to do in the end is to retaliate, to push back. And that is kind of what we're seeing now is there is beginning to be this hostage situation where too many people have been silent for too long. And then when people get the pressure on them to not be silent, once they sense the danger, they are now just going to comply. And that's the role. That's the place we don't want to go. And that's the important thing to do is not to comply, to do something like similar to what like Barry Weiss just did with the resignation letter. She not only did not comply, she did not stay silent. She drove to the point where it's like, I'm going to sacrifice my position at a huge publication for a dream role that all journalists want, just to push back against the system, to push back against the hostage takers.
Yep. Yeah. So that's, we were talking about these movies where people have been taken hostage, been taken captive, and how there's usually some, especially if it's a group, there are some people who say, just give them what they want, and so we can get through this, right? So there's some assumed paradigm of if I give them what they want and if I just go along, then I can get back to my normal life, right? Like this won't have any permanent effect. I just want to get through this. And then some of the movies, like I thought about, I think it was Split, and what was the other one I brought up? Was it 12 Cloverfield Lane?
12 Cloverfield Lane, yep.
Yeah, where in both of those movies, the protagonist at some point finds a dead body or something and realizes, they're going to kill me if I stay in this situation. And what I told you then when we were talking is, I hesitate to even use some of that verbiage because I don't want to be hyperbolic or seem over the top or anything like that or alarmist. And that's not our goal here, right? But the point that we're making, like you were saying, of like, you can't just do nothing. Like they have demands, right? That the hostage takers, they have demands that they're making of you. So inaction isn't an option. It might be an option temporarily, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're in Die Hard, just sitting in the lobby or in that, whatever floor they're on, 30th floor, I think, in Nakatomi Plaza, that's an option for a while. But at some point, they force you up to the roof with guns, and then they're going to blow the roof. So the point is that, you can do that for a little while, but at some point, they're going to start making demands of you. And the longer you sit doing nothing and thinking you're just going to get through it, the harder it gets to actually act in opposition, as you said, resistance. whenever it becomes necessary. And the other thing, so I want to get your thoughts on this. We talked about this, but in terms of why I think why this is important, right, is there's a lot of talk about power right now. We're going to talk about power. We are talking about power. Hierarchies have to do with power and influence. Okay, so a lot of talk about power, and a lot of this has been brought up. Some of the postmodernists who, everything's about power. That Foucault and Derrida. It's things aren't about anything other than every relationship. Everything can be boiled down to who has the power and who doesn't. And there's a lot of talk about power, and like I told you before, power isn't something I've necessarily really given a lot of thought to previously. There was a guy who I used to hang out with some, and he was a really great guy, but he had his conspiracies that he was kind of into. And I remember one point he told me about, oh, dude, there's this like dozen people, and they have the secret society, and they control the whole world, and it's this, the kind of Illuminati kind of stuff. And I told him, I said, well, first off, if that's true, what on earth are we supposed to do about it? Like, well, okay, like, I guess, let's say I believe you. Like, okay, what are we going to do? Some 12 people control the whole planet. What are you and I going to do? And then the other thing is, I was like, things are pretty good. Like, if that's true, let's say that's true. Let's say I believe you. Things are pretty good. Like, and they're getting better. Things aren't perfect, of course. There's lots of things that happen that are awful in the world. But if you were to try to get an aggregate of all of atrocities happening on planet Earth right now compared to all of atrocities happening on planet Earth 200 years ago, there's way more happening 200 years ago than there are right now. And so things are getting better, as Steven Pinker points out. And so I'm like, those 12 aren't doing too bad. Like, and so I guess, I can't do anything about it, and I'm not sure I'd even want to. So my point is, Bill Gates. Right. Yes. So my point is that power is only a problem to the degree in which it's being exercised maliciously. So in other words, if whoever has the power isn't wielding it in a way that's extractive or malevolent or malicious or corrupt in a way, that's really felt all around, then it's not that big of a deal. So I don't really, my governor has a lot of power. I don't know my governor's name. That's the problem. But my mayor has power. I don't know my mayor's name. The police officers in my town have power. I don't know their names. Why? Well, because I trust what's happening here. I trust my surroundings are fine. I know what to expect tomorrow. I don't feel any sense of threat from my state representatives that they're going to all of a sudden strip my rights away. And so I'm not as concerned with the power around me because I mentally view it as legitimate. And so the reason why this is important is because there are people who are rising to the top of the hierarchy here and who are seeking power. So the hostage taker gets power, like you said, through silence, through people, and by being able to make demands of you. And so there are people that are what you would say maybe shoring up or acquiring power and influence on these other things, through various means that aren't what you would say someone that you would want to, that's someone who isn't going to wield it in a non-malicious way. These are not benevolent wielders of power. And that's not even to say that like our president is some benevolent wielder of power, right? Like a person can wield power and not be the best person, but also not be wielding that power in a way that's fundamentally harmful to you. And so I'm not saying that the metric for being able to wield power or someone that I'm concerned with having power is moral perfection or anything like that. It's just, can I look at you and say, you're probably, in other words, I'm going to measure you by the harm or lack thereof that you do, not by how, benevolent and perfect you are. And there are people who are acquiring power and who are seeking to wield power right now in a way that, first off, people don't realize the way that they've shored this up. I think they're starting to. And then secondly, they have a vision for how they want to wield that power that is fundamental. Like it is whenever you're in the movie and you find the body and you're like, holy crap, like that. Okay, there's no getting through this. There's going to be a lot of collateral damage on the other side of it. There are people who want to wield power right now and influence in our society in a way that is so fundamentally destructive to our way of life, to our rights, to our liberties, and the system that's brought so much prosperity for the world. And so that's why that's important. Does that make sense? Did I leave anything out there that you can think of?
Yeah, well, it's just how did that power change so quickly? And it is that point, in the movie where you start to realize you're in danger, but you may not have like noticed it up to that time, or you think you kind of have that uneasy feeling. It's kind of like the radicals were, a couple of years ago. It's like, okay, you see the radicals, they're just these silly people who no one's ever going to listen to, and all of a sudden they grab power. All of a sudden, they're one of their main lines still is speaking truth to power, but they didn't even realize that they are the power now. So speaking truth to power has no risk for them anymore.
Yep.
Right. So they say criticizing the president is speaking truth to power. It's like you can say anything you want about the president on Twitter, on Facebook. No one's kicking in your door after that. But you criticize the wrong person on those social media platforms, or criticize the wrong movement on those social media platforms, and your job could be gone. Your life could be upended. So there's been a power switch, and I know you mentioned it before. It's something that Ben Shapiro mentioned, that these people don't realize that they are in power. They are the ones who are the powerful, who are not speaking truth to power anymore. That they are the people in the driver's seat now.
Who doesn't? Let's so two things. Let's make a distinction here and be specific. Who would you say doesn't realize that they are the ones in the driver's seat? Because I think there's two groups within one group that's operating. So who would you say doesn't realize, whenever they say speaking truth to power, that they have the power? And if there are people who do realize it, who are those? What is that group?
Mm-hmm. So I would say the people who don't realize they're in power and they're still speaking as if they are speaking truth to power are going to be the followers of the movement.
Yep.
That's the everyday people, the people you're friends with on Facebook who are doing these insane white privilege things, the white privilege mea culpas, and saying how awful it is we have this racist system, who are the ones who truly believe they don't have the power to make a change. So they're trying to revolt. The people who are in charge of those movements, the people who hold all the influence in those movements, there are a ton. I can't even think of any of the names right now, but there are a ton of people who are the main influencers there, that are the ones that have the power, and they know they have the power now.
Yep.
And they're utilizing it for their own means. But there is still an advantage to keep this veil of ignorance over their followers to make sure that they stay passionate about the movement. Say we won, the passion starts to go away.
Yep.
And so they understand the power of that ignorance that they can still feed to the people who are following the movement that they're in charge of.
That's right. Yeah. So I think that's important. And that the way I divide those two groups, well, it's not different. Those who are followers in the movement and those who are what you'd call the thought leaders, there's a different category, but that's something we can get into later, or we inevitably will at another point. But yeah, so the point is, there are some people who are like, well, I'm just speaking truth to power, and they really think they're doing that, right? They think they are speaking from outside of the power hierarchy towards the power hierarchy. And then there's people who, so whenever you talked about the president, I thought about, like, okay, if you were to make a list of all the things that the president could say about, let's say AOC or Ilhan Omar or Adam Schiff, all the things he could say that he could get away with and wouldn't be criticized for, and make a practical physical list, and you put it on the whiteboard, and then you make a list of all the things that those people could say about the president that they could get away with and wouldn't be criticized for, like that wouldn't receive a hefty amount of criticism, right? Which list is bigger? Are they the same size? Like what?
No, I would say the latter list could be in one size font, and the other one could be in 100 size font, and the latter one's going to be much longer. The president can't tweet the letters AOC and not have that spun as some sort of like death threat against her.
Yeah, if he said AOC is a very smart woman, that would be met with criticism, right? And that goes to that.
Well, smart women is just a construct of whiteness. So.
Right. And what is a woman, right? So like, why is he
Exactly.
even gendering them in the first place?
He is a dude.
So well, yeah, of course. But the point is that goes into that kind of Overton asymmetry. And that's the thing that I think that we will want to talk about with what makes a hierarchy corrupt definitionally. So now that we've kind of talked about, so hopefully I'll ask you, do you feel like what we just kind of where we put a placeholder in, do you feel like we've paid some justice so that people understand why we think this is important? Like if you had to I'm going to really try and put a fine point on why we think this is important. Do you feel like we did that? Is there something that you could say in one sentence to put a fine point on it? Like what do you think? Because I feel like that's important.
Yeah. I mean, it's important because we're starting to see it every day. Like, the example I gave, we kind of all have that friend on Facebook or social media who is going all out SJW. And I'm not trying to just say that as a pejorative, but they are true believers in this oppression narrative. And they believe it is their job to fight the power here. And they haven't begun to realize that they're the ones in power. So that's why this is important, because you have friends like that who are just being completely taken over, and it's hard to see. It's breaking relationships, and that's what's affecting you. We didn't think about these people because they didn't affect our lives. The radicals, you could read their books, whatever, it didn't matter. But now they're starting to affect personal relationships and really starting to affect a lot of the individuals, and that's why you're starting to see this become a more and more important subject.
Totally. And so on a micro level, I would say there's that in terms of like you said, we all have that friend. And I would say that the way they're functioning is a way that is harmful for our mental health. And we can get into that. That's that whole other abuse aspect. And on a macro level, if you were to take the sum total of all of those friends that everyone has, those people are granting legitimacy to an ideology and a structure that is now inhabiting the hierarchies in our legacy media and in just our culture generally, that they're not benign or benevolent wielders of power, right? So on the micro level, those relationships that are getting messed up are also those people on the other end of that. One, they're buying into something that's harmful, so that matters. And those relationships we have with them matter. Their impact on society matters. And the people they're granting legitimacy to as a result of their actions really matters because of the goals, desires, stated goals and desires of those people and of that ideology and of that movement. So that really matters, because it's not just we can stay quiet and get through this. It's no, there's a real danger here on a micro level with our relationships, and on a macro level with our society on the whole. Would you say that that's a decent?
Exactly.
Okay. All right, cool. All right. So placeholder removed.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've kind of put it out there of like why this is important. There's a body in the air ducts, and we found it, and we're next as a society here. So we need to do something. Inaction is not an option. They have demands. So go back to the historical occupants of those hierarchies, and you mentioned there was a shift at some point in time, right? Mm-hmm. So I have my own thoughts about the hierarchies and when they shifted, and really what hierarchies changed first, right? So in one of those slides I had, there's multiple hierarchies, and a lot of them overlap. Some overlap significantly. So in your mind, what were they historically? When did they shift? How did they shift? Like, how do you see the past, what you would say, the past game that was played, the past arrangement compared to the present game that's being played and the present arrangement? How would you word that? And when do you think that the change took place from the left-right perspective, not from the inside the left perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say the change has been gradual for decades now, and it really started with the main institutions of learning influencing the next generations. And they to give them credit, they played the long ball game, right?
Oh yeah.
They were ingrained in institutions, and now it doesn't really matter what hierarchy you come out with. Although I would say in terms of competence in the, I guess, to either trusted moral leaders or the experts, I guess, and the experts and the professors and these people who are teaching everyone all these different sets of values. They're teaching that in the institutions, and then all of those people are populating the other hierarchies. And the switch is starting to come because the people at the top of the hierarchies, some of that new generation that have been taught these things now become CEOs of these massive businesses that are at the top of the hierarchy because they've been shown to be so competent over long periods of time that they're changing the behavior and pointing directly inward to the hierarchy and saying, the system that I'm in, the system that I'm profiting from has become corrupt. And they kind of want to show that they want to break it down, although in reality they obviously don't. I think they're trying to take either some sort of marketing advantage. They're either trying to take some sort of marketing advantage from it, or they're just trying to say, please don't cancel me. Let me live a little bit longer. I'll help you find out where the guy who's in the Ducks, who's taken out all of the guys who are trying to hold everyone hostage. But as long as you save me, and maybe I'll survive this whole thing. That is what the people at the top of those hierarchies are trying to do. But it really started with the takeover of the institutions that allowed and taught all of these people their ideology, and then those people went to go populate the rest of the hierarchies. I think that's where it began. Now, what the direct switch is, I don't know. It seems like it's been more recent, but that's just because it's been ramped up so quickly. This flip has again been gradual, but we have seen, the scale and the power being wielded by some of these bad actors, I guess we could say, just increase. And maybe that's has something to do. Well, it definitely has something to do with social media used as a microphone for some of these people. Whereas, speaking truth to power kind of changed when the president was able to go on cable television and speak his mind. But now any person with a blue check mark can go on Twitter and speak their mind, and it's just about as powerful as the president is.
Yep.
So now you have that kind of power distribution out there, and that's part of what's kind of legitimizing that power for them.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't expect you to take the education angle, but I agree, of course. That's Stephen Hicks writes and speaks extensively about that with, the way that, because really that's getting to the root of where did the Marxists go, basically, and they rebrand as postmodernists, and I call them the four horsemen get their, write their PhDs, get the PhDs. I think it was in the mid to late 50s to the early 60s, Lyotard, Derrida, Foucault, and Rorty. I think maybe Richard Rorty's the fourth. I could be wrong. But anyway, where did they go? Well, they went into academia. And then they brainstormed new ways to build a new proletariat. But that's another angle there. So yeah, so I agree with you on that part. So here's my question. Let's say, take a different, this is just a metaphor off the top of my head, could be really bad. But let's say, so you said they infiltrate higher ed and they indoctrinate people, and then they send them off to these other hierarchies. Okay. I think that's right, fundamentally. Okay. How would you say that translates to overall societal power and influence? Because what we're really talking about, so I have a thought in my mind. Like I said, I didn't expect the education thing, but I like it, so we can play with that for a second. So how does that infiltrating higher ed translate automatically to societal power and influence, because there's lots of different ideas that have infiltrated and taken over different aspects of higher ed that we don't feel the effects of on a societal level. So Eric Weinstein likes to talk about, what are the physics? There's this one group in physics, string theorists, about how the string theorists took over physics and ruined it since, I think it was the late 60s or early 70s. And okay, so that happened in physics. So they took over that part of higher ed, string theory did, the string theorists. But I don't know the effects of that. I can't feel the effect. I can't go, okay, here's all the ways in which string theory taking over higher ed physics departments for the last 5 decades is screwing up society right now. Like, I don't know that. I'm not a physicist. But people that aren't physicists, people that aren't sociologists, people that aren't historians do feel the effects of what we're talking about here. So how does that, like, infiltration of higher ed translate to societal influence and power? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's bridge that gap.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that happen in the higher ed, including the broadening out of what we're educating about. Higher ed, it was great for the STEM fields, and you don't see this effect, kind of like you said in physics, the STEM field. You don't see kind of the new, what I would say, like wokeism affecting those as much, although you do in a way, but I think it's actually a different reason they affect those. I would say the people who went through these institutions and were taught these things in different majors, like maybe more of an English major or liberal arts or poli-sci and all of these stuff, they go into certain roles in society. And these roles normally include a lot of government type stuff. And when you go through STEM fields, you go through private industry where you're going to start creating things, but government is not exactly, or influencing people is not exactly your top priority. It is more creating business. And I think a lot of these people who kind of went through the indoctrination course, basically, that you have to go through these certain classes that are mostly controlled by people with this certain ideology, they end up going either into more philosophical type fields where they're going to be talking more directly to the people, or government, people that were trying to say, hey, this government is here for you, but these are also what I believe in, and these are kind of the things that we should all believe. And so and I think positions like HR is a big one too. Like, people are too
James
scared
Lindsay
to get
talks
sued.
about that a lot.
Yeah,
Don't let your HR go
that's the
woke, is
biggest
what he
one.
says.
Exactly, but that's the biggest thing, and that's public relations type stuff. Like, you have to be able to present yourself as not only a business, but a business for the people. And I think that mindset kind of infected even larger business, where it's like, okay, through marketing, I need to make sure that I don't step on anyone's toes. And, as someone who's like, Black Lives Matter, you can say that and the average person is not going to be insulted by that.
Yep.
But it also takes on another meaning. So I think you're able to get through with messages like that through the larger companies that originally came through the institutions, that no one is going to fight against it. Or the people who would fight against it is like, it's not worth my time or the backlash to fight against something like that, so I'm just going to stay quiet. And all of a sudden we're here now, where everyone, Nike, Starbucks, all these big companies must amplify these messages in order to stay alive.
Yep.
And that started a while ago, and I think that kind of went through the institution. I know it's not a perfect way to answer your question, but yeah, I mean, again, that's that indoctrination that started there has now seeped into society. A lot of it either went through business, but again, that is part of society. I think that is a huge influence there, and has slowly influenced as it gone along the way to make sure, one, people are not going to be offended. So again, you put up these kind of non-offensive terms that are still building a narrative towards something.
Yep. Yeah, so I totally agree with that. I find myself more and more lately saying the tactics, strategies, and really the fruits of the labor that has been sown and enacted by this ideology and the proponents is something that you almost would respect, in terms of just how patient and successful it's been if it wasn't so damn destructive, right?
Mm.
The branding of something like Black Lives Matter, anti-fascist, love wins, any of these things, like the branding is so phenomenally good. There's a whole nother, I think I told you about this paper that I wrote a couple years ago, and I talked about the dialectic issue of trying to combat a lot of these ideas and the ideology. And I took the approach of the marketing aspect and the religious aspect. And the marketing aspect is all of these ideas are incredibly sticky, incredibly transmissible. They are things that check every box for something that would go viral, for something that is a marketing kind of gold mine, because of the different things that are required for those ideas. Like if you're trying to sell a product, so that aspect, that you mentioned, I think is correct. So they take over the institutions, then they have these really brilliant propaganda campaigns and techniques in terms of hijacking the language. That's something that Hayek wrote about in The Road to Serfdom. So equality doesn't really mean equality. That's what James Lindsay is doing with New Discourses, his website. People who are listening to this who haven't been there need to go to James Lindsay's website, where he's making a dictionary for understanding this like critical theory vernacular, where it's like, oh, okay, so you hear this word and you think it means this. No, it doesn't. It actually means this thing that's probably the opposite of that. So because, that's what Hayek says, is people think they're buying into something. Like there's no reason to create a whole new set of definitions. That's way harder. It's much better to change the definition of words that people already know and use so that it conforms to what you want it to mean, so that people are agreeing with you without realizing they're agreeing with you. And they give you how.
That's very similar to what Orwell did at the end of 1984. If you read
Yep.
the appendix, that he actually goes through the full newspeak dictionary
Yep.
and explains to what they change. And it's mostly it's consolidating words into a smaller grouping of words. So it's, instead of saying good and bad, we don't need words good and bad. You say good and not good.
Yep.
It's as simple as that. But you are redefining language because they take out certain words that lead to critical thinking.
Yep.
And that's, a main, part of this type of behavior. And I know we talked about a little bit before this, they're developing a bit of a cult-like behavior when it comes to making their demands, because I want to say their strategy has changed a little bit. It used to be, you talk about branding. I can't even look at a rainbow without thinking about this, but the gay pride movement,
Mm-hmm.
it used to be a movement of love. The LGBT before that long strung out
The
list of
alphabet.
letters, right?
Group.
The alphabet people.
Alphabet people, like Chappelle says. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. But it was all about love and acceptance, and now it's about demands and fear. I mean, they've completely changed their strategy, and that's what you see in the abusive relationship. That's what you see more in a cult to keep people in it.
So just to be specific here, it's not that they, as in everyone who would fall into that category has, but the people steering the ship, right?
Exactly.
So let's use like Dave Rubin as an example. Well, Dave Rubin falls into the G category of the LGBT, Q, LMNOP, all these other things, but he's not someone who's trying to do that, right? So in all of these facets, whether it's race, sexuality, trans, all these things, gender, they have all been hijacked to serve the ends of what you would say is a super. They're all subordinate to a greater movement or ideology, so that there are people who claim to be being represented, or they don't claim. There are others who claim to represent them and be advocating for them, right? I'm offended on behalf of so and so. But
what do they call allies?
Yeah, allies, dude. I've got a whole thing on. Can I tell you my quick? Can we put another placeholder? I have not had a place to. I swear, I tweet at. There are certain people that I'm like, dude, just read this. I think you would dig it. But who knows? I've got like 170 Twitter followers. So allies, I think, is really interesting. term, and they function really similarly in society too. So I was watching, there's this really horrible movie called Priest. I remember seeing it in theaters and I remember not liking it. It's on Netflix now. And I for some reason watched it. I made the same mistake with Ghost Rider, the first one with Nicolas Cage. And I'm like, I know this movie sucks. I'm pretty sure that it sucked. And then I watch it again. I'm like, God, that does suck. Why did I watch this again? Anyway, so Priest is this movie, but it's a vampire movie. And in vampire lore, and I think in like greater, mythology of, like vampires, werewolves and stuff, there's this group called familiars. Do you know what a familiar is?
Yep. But they did the same thing in Blade and stuff, I'm pretty sure. Same terminology.
Yes. So a familiar in the lore of like vampires and stuff is a person who wants access to the power of, the vampire. Okay, we'll use vampires here because this ideology is parasitic, so it works. And it also seems like it can't be killed. But familiars want access to that. They want to be they want to be made one of the immortals. And so they completely subordinate and demean themselves so that, like, to serve their vampire overlords, in hopes of one day becoming one of them and having the same power and status as them. And so I see allies, there's a really twisted, new, as you said, rebranding. There's a new racism that's taking hold here. And so I see people who are, really working hard to be good allies, as a form of, and what's funny is that the Robin DiAngelos and all these people who identify, the good whites as being part of the problem, I'm like, yeah, I'm with you on that, because there are people who are legitimizing this and who are buying into this new racism and everyone has to be defined by their groups and all this other stuff. But I think they're doing it so that they can have access to that power. And maybe one day I can be one of you. Maybe one day I'll be accepted and it become one, but in the meantime, I'm going to humiliate and demean myself, and all these things, and fully subordinate myself to whatever your demands are, so that I can, just in hopes of doing that. I see allyship really similar to, the way the familiars operate in some of those movies where they're like, no, these are our overlords and we do whatever, because one day we want to be them. And it's a way that we can kind of get, we bought into the power hierarchy here, this newly defined system. And so we just want to be as close to the periphery as possible. And one day hopefully being welcomed in. And if you're, a white cisgendered, heterosexual person, what hope do you have? And why do you think there's so many people that are totally straight and they're coming out as queer? Because it's totally ill-defined. And it's a way that they can get some type of access to that new power, right? Because they have no other way of doing it. So I feel like a lot of these people who are buying into this allyship, they're just familiars, they're just serving their vampire overlords, and the vampires are like, yeah, okay, dude, not gonna happen. You're white.
Yeah, that's an Orwellian.
Queer,
yeah, I mean, that's an Orwellian doublethink term. Ally. It's just like an ally. It's like black dude in a mega hat to me. I'm not going to consider him an ally. This is an individual who likes Trump. Like, he's just a guy. Like, he's no ally to me. We might think the exact same stuff, but it's not like I'm gonna just label that person because he's a non-white agreeing with this white ideology. It's not how it works. But an ally in their context is meant to be, that, like, a person on the outside trying to help the people on the inside.
Yep.
But also, it's really, in reality, it's just like a person we're not going to go after right now, because there are plenty of allies who end up getting canceled if they don't, again, keep moving sufficiently leftwards. So ally doesn't always mean what you think it means, depending on whatever context the people who hold the power actually want.
And I would say, so my last thought on this is I think ally is as, if not more important, not because of the term ally, but because of the inference of that term. Well, if you're not an ally, what are you?
Access power.
You're an enemy. Yeah, you're an enemy. So you've now created a dichotomy that people are subconsciously buying into. Well, if you're not an ally, what are you? Well, you're my enemy. There, in other words, back to the hostage thing, there is no neutral party here. Silence is violence. If you're neutral, if you don't, if you're just trying to do your own thing, that's not going to be an option. So you're for us or you're against us. If you're not an ally, you're our enemy. And you better stay up to date on what it looks like to be an ally, because that list is constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. Okay. So from the education thing, so I agree with you. So going back, so we're going to put that placeholder, or take the placeholder out. So I had asked you how you think that the hierarchy shifted, what took place, and you brought up the fact that the left, and really, where did all the Marxists go? Well, they went underground. And they did something very smart, which was they infiltrated higher ed, and then it's just a numbers and time, numbers plus time. So I agree with that. So the way that I would say, so tell me what you think about this, and if there's how we could expand on it, or if it's totally wrong, do that. Tell me that too. But the way I see it as that ideas are powerful due to legitimacy. Legitimacy is granted through consensus, and consensus is just a numbers game, right? So really, that's just maybe a way of being totally nerd formulatic about it. But I see the way where I put the shift, and a lot of this has to do with so much of the stuff that I've learned about. A lot of this is just my own research and my own experience, my own lived experience. So you can't challenge it, actually. But, from growing up, Democrat, blue, what you'd say a blue dog Democrat, in a small rural community in the Midwest, but still growing up in that milieu. And the way that I was kind of exposed to, what the thoughts and assumptions were about like the Reagan Republicans compared to the Democrats, and the cultural shift that I saw is I put it in the 90s personally. So the way I look at it as, so in that slide about hierarchies of power, my thought is unofficial hierarchies of influence precede hierarchies of systemic power if it's going to last. So what I mean is a person might achieve a role of power within a system temporarily, but the power is granted from their title. So you remove the title from the person and they lose it, right? But a person who has achieved their power and influence by virtue of who they are and people that support them and are behind them, and that they're leading on an individual level. So in other words, I wouldn't care about what the president, whoever occupies the Oval Office, I don't care about what that person has to say unless they're occupying the Oval Office. But there are other people who I really trust their thoughts and trust them as leaders and as thinkers, that regardless of what their job title is, they're gonna have influence over me. Does that make sense? So my thought is that if you're gonna have what you would say maybe is enduring power and influence, is that I think that having social pull and societal sway and people behind you, in other words, occupying an unofficial hierarchy, has to come first, I think, or at least for your ideas. And so,
well, that's the idea of a popular vote, effectively, right?
Sure.
You don't have a position, but you have name recognition. The better power you have, not political sway, but social sway you have, will grant you political power.
Right. No, that's right. Yeah, my point is that a person who is voted into a position can be voted out of that position, but there is a process. There is an official process for doing that. Whereas someone who just becomes influential, like, it's a lot harder to pin down and to enumerate the ways in which they gained that influence. Like, you could do it, sure, but it's just a lot harder to pin down because it wasn't part of a predetermined process with set inputs and set outputs, like an election would be. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the way I think about it is in the 90s. So I look at this as a lot as an outsider from both sides now, but about how it seems to me that there was a point when certain things that were associated with the left went from being outside of the mainstream to being inside of the mainstream. And it seems like that really mainly happened in the 90s. I think one of the really big ones was, well, there's a few, but one of them, I think Ellen DeGeneres and her TV show and her coming out and, being this big part of, pop culture. I remember on the cover of, I think it was People magazine. I remember I don't know how old I was very little, but I remember it said, "I'm gay," just on, on that. And so this thing that was kind of a taboo kind of thing for a while that you would say was simmering in the subculture rose up to the culture. I think Will and Grace kind of did a little bit of that as well, where people, maybe another way, this is a thought I literally just had, but another way to think about it is people who went from, or different things went from being caricatures to being taken seriously. So you go from having, a gay character from being a caricature, just kind of like maybe like the guy, I don't know if you've seen the movie Airplane, but I think about the guy who's in the radio control tower, and he's just like this super flamboyant gay guy, from going that to like, no, I'm a serious person. Right. So I think about that as being a big one, because I think that's one of the main battles in the culture war that the right lost, that they bet their moral authority on, and they lost with the greater culture. So they passed like anti-sodomy laws and stuff, and they bet their moral authority. I think they made the mistake. I don't have a lot of sympathy for like diehard conservatives that existed in the realm of policymaking in the 90s, because I think they were so arrogant with the power they had under Reagan, and then I guess Bush's first term, his only term, that they did the thing that the left is doing, where they say, well, we're just going to legislate our morality and just assume we're always going to be in power. The only difference is the ones who are trying to do it now are trying to implement things that make sure that they actually do maintain power the whole time. So that's where I see it as switching, because I think that there's this societal legitimacy that comes from being the ones who are perceived to be moral. Because a lot of times your problem solving stems from that, right? So what do you do in a war situation? Well, you're going to trust the people that can make the case for like, this is the right thing to do. We're going to go into Rwanda because it's the right thing to do. So whoever seems like the people that you trust to make the case for what is the right thing to do feels like they have the most power and influence in society, and then they use that position to obtain other positions. And it feels like the right lost the moral authority in the 90s, I think. I think that homosexuality was a big one, rap music, video games, some of that kind of stuff, some of that censorship kind of thing, I think also plays a part of it. The way that I think that whenever there was, and there's still people trying to do this, but trying to basically say that Christianity and conservatism are synonyms. And so in order to be a good conservative, you have to implement all these Christian things, I think is a huge mistake, because you've just alienated a huge part of the country. So I see them losing the moral battle for the culture in the 90s, really. And well, how do we know? Well, look who was elected. Bill Clinton, this guy that was the schmoozer dude. And he got 2 terms. There was a lot of scandals. He got 2 terms. And yes, George H.W. Bush did get elected in 2000, but it was so incredibly close. They had to have a recount in Florida, and then he stays in because of 9/11, right? So that's why that happens. But the response is Barack Obama, and the most widespread set of like leftist policy implementation since the 60s. So that's when I think they lost, and I think that's how that was where they started. So there's this, if we're going to go back, I'm going to bring it back. Okay. Hierarchies. How do they switch? What are we even talking about? I don't even know. Right. But we're talking about how did the hierarchies switch? And my point is there's hierarchies that are unofficial, right, that have non-enumerated powers, but we just know that they're influential. There are people. So the example I gave you before we started this video was when you have a friend group in high school, there are people that you know are the popular people they're the ones who are the most popular. They're the influencers. It's not written down what their set of powers is somewhere. Like that's not an enumerated set of powers, but you know it and everyone around knows it. But it's not like they're the same as the principal who has a given set of powers and authorities. And as soon as that person is no longer principal, they lose that power and legitimacy in the hierarchy. My point is that to have enduring influence on the culture, you have to start in the unofficial legitimacy hierarchies, like that's Martin Luther King, for example, then to try and start with the system and work backwards from it. So that's where I see it as in the 90s. I don't know if that sounds right, if there's some edits you'd make there, but that's where I think, so to put a fine point, if the argument is the left and the right switched in terms of hierarchies, well, what's the hierarchy? The hierarchy is influence over the culture and then control over the systems, the physical. So we're talking about hardware and software here. The hardware that comes from being part of the systems, and you get that way because people grant you legitimacy. But so that the right was operating within these hierarchies, and I think they had control or influence over the culture because of a perceived morality, but I think they lost the perception of having the moral high ground somewhere in the 90s, and it became vacant. And I think there are people, the left began to moved into that position by default just because it was vacant. And that's where I think that the cultural switch took place, and we're feeling the effects of what happens when the culture switches. Well, now you have access to the actual systems. So I don't know if that sounds somewhere in the ballpark to you. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of what you're getting at in the 90s was a bit of the culture's downstream from, or politics is downstream from culture kind of thing, where it started in the culture and then we're starting to see it manifest in our politics. And even with the election of Bush, although he be considered conservative, guy really wasn't super conservative in his policies. The guy was trying to do that compassionate conservatism angle, and that didn't work out well for him. So, but there's certainly that I don't even know if I'd separate the hierarchies of influence into explicit and implicit, where the explicit is the president has that position. He's gone. Well, this particular case, and actually I think we're seeing it manifest in an interesting way here, that President Obama is no longer president, but has his influence really gone down much? Not really. If Donald Trump is voted out as president, does his influence go down much? Not really. His powers do. His abilities to actually explicitly implement certain things will go down, but his power or his influence over the culture is not the same. Whereas you didn't really see that as much with President Bush or Clinton or the other Bush, or a lot of these figures, once they're out of power, they just kind of slowly went away. Although we kind of see it ramp up since then, but the influence over the system, I'd almost put it, as like there is not as large of a gap between the influence of the president and LeBron James, or the president and some of these other massive figures, because I think the way we look at these figures has changed, where we start to look up to celebrities and athletes a bit more. Maybe that again might have been caused more by social media, because now we can kind of speak directly to these people. But they hold these large thresholds of power and influence, even though they don't hold an explicit position. And then the interesting thing is, they're in power now. Let's say this one progressive group is in power now. What they're doing differently than I would say when the right has been in power, especially after Obama's first term, when the right just took a whole bunch of seats, and there was a huge pushback against President Obama that you saw politically, and I think the right actually took over a lot of power there. You're seeing them now set up an infrastructure for the future. It seems like they're actually still going to play the long game, and what they're doing now is they're trying to change the curriculum you teach kids. 1619 revisionist history that they're going to start to demand the kids to learn. And I think they realize that politically they're going to end up losing at some point. I mean, anyone who knows anything about politics, there is no such thing as there'll never be another Republican voted in again, because political parties are not that extraordinarily rigid where they're never going to change their positions. It's kind of like the gay marriage thing. Gay marriage is going to start to float away from the Republican platform because they know it's a lost goal. And now the kind of libertarian idea came in there that's like, well, government shouldn't be involved with marriage anyway, so it's not their problem anymore. You start to see them reform, and that way they're going to reform enough to be able to be electable in a future election, is normally how you're going to see a political party move. But I think the people in power now, especially over the culture, are setting up this white fragility argument that is going to allow them to maintain that power even after the people in those explicit positions of power are gone. And I think they're building up for the future that is going to be an extremely damaging way, but they're building up for the future by changing the past a little bit.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So they're building that infrastructure, and that's part of that hierarchy that they're building. They're maintaining it and building the infrastructure to maintain that hierarchy, I guess, and hoping that that's going to change the way we rebuild future hierarchies, I think is their goal. So they're playing the long game, just like they did. I would say it started probably in like the 60s or even earlier than then, when they started to influence the university. And then you're probably right with the 90s, because I don't remember much from the 90s. I was really young, but I always heard of the religious right and how damaging, even though I agree with a lot of what they stand for, but they're extremely damaging culturally.
Yep.
Because they tried to force their morality onto others, and it was just a time where you couldn't do that. And now we start to see a new version of the religious right that isn't on the right, it's the religious left, effectively, that is doing the exact same thing, that they're forcing their morality down your throat.
That's right. So I have three different thoughts. I think I'm probably only going to talk about two of them, because the third one I might have actually just forgot. So the first one is, Obama doesn't have as much influence as you'd think now, because the progressives hate him. They hate his guts. So that's one thing. That's just an aside. What I would say is, are Barack Obama and Donald Trump's, so I think you're right. So let me first say this, that if Donald Trump wasn't president, would he still have influence? Yes. Now, here's the question. Is Donald Trump influential? Was he influential? Was Barack Obama influential? Is he influential? Because who they are and something they did that's unique, or because they're seen to embody a set of ideas? Now, Trump is a unique character, and I think that people treat him uniquely for good reason, but also for bad reason. In other words, I think there are obviously unique things about Donald Trump, in the same way there are unique things about Barack Obama. I think Barack Obama is the left's Ronald Reagan. But the things that are unique about Donald Trump, a lot of them, I think that Donald Trump is a proxy or a symbol of certain ideas, thoughts, and values to a group of people. What Ben Shapiro calls him, a giant pulsating middle finger, right? So in other words, if Donald Trump didn't seem like a giant pulsating middle finger to the left, he wouldn't be influential. Like, I think that's one reason why President Bush isn't influential, because he didn't represent that to the people that voted him in. So whenever he's out of power, no one cares what he has to say. And also, in his defense, he didn't seek any public life afterwards. So in his defense. But I think that those people are influential because of what they represent, not because of, and so they represent a certain set of ideas, and then they have some unique skills that they can plug it, like Scott Adams' talent stack, that they plug into representing those ideas, that make them really good advocates for those ideas and really good representatives of those ideas. But without being associated with that idea set, they wouldn't have any influence, I don't think. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, we the problem is the last two cases we have are really unique. Like you said, President Trump had this amazing career before this, and so he was already very influential. And then also with Obama, when you go back and you say who we're electing a celebrity president, well, the first celebrity president we ever elected was Obama. I mean, he, if you don't think he was a celebrity before the election, he certainly was after. And, I'll admit that I wasn't old enough, I don't believe, to vote for him the first time in 2008, but I felt a sense of pride, even though I know if I would have voted, I would have voted for McCain at the time, I think.
Yeah, it was McCain.
The McCain one, yeah. But yeah, even I felt a sense of pride. And then again, with the evolution of social media, that really made him become a celebrity. So these last two are so unique, and it'll be interesting to see how it moves forward, to see who's, is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson going to be on ticket for 2024? Like, I don't know. Are we just going to keep doing this celebrity game or I don't know. I don't know how it's going to end up, but that's a different conversation.
Well, no, it's not. So I think that actually ties into the other thought that I had, which was, so the distinction that you made earlier, you referenced competence hierarchies, right? And how hierarchies, the ones that form organically out of, problem solution issues, are competence hierarchies. So we have a problem. Whoever is most competent will probably find the solution to it, and they're going to rise to the top of the hierarchy, right? So are we going to continue down this celebrity road? Well, maybe a better question is, why be down that in the first place? Well, has competence become removed from the game and the needs so much that it's actually not the primary factor now, unless there's a big issue, right? So right now, because of coronavirus, people are thinking about competence. Now, I think that they're putting too much weight on what the president does, compared to governors and mayors and stuff. But competence, in other words, competence is a value that comes out of necessity. So I have this theory that I call the theory of expanding aesthetic, which is that as society developed, whenever we first started to create tools and mechanisms and things, we always started with what does it need, and then we shifted to what do we want it to look like. So think about earliest primitive man probably didn't start, so I used to do, archaeology stuff with my dad. And if you find pottery and things, you see these like cool things that natives made. And when they first conceived of, I'm going to make a jar or whatever, I'm going to make a thing. Like, what do you think they started with? Do you think they started with, see you later. Do you think they started with what do I want it to look like? Or do you think they started with what does it need? Like, if you're a native in that situation, you're starting with, I need it to hold water. I needed to do these things. Like, in other words, I'm really, really close to my needs. I know that if I don't have a thing that holds water right now, then I will not have water. So the closer you are to the need not being met, or to what you would call absolute zero, if you're using like prospect theory, then the more you're going to focus on the needs of a thing. And then once the needs are met, so let's think about a shelter. So I build a shelter, right? So I've done some of the stuff, like, when I guided and done some primitive skills. You build a shelter, first you focus on what does it need, and then once it's performing its function, then you go, well, what do I want it to look like around inside? Like, you don't start with, I really want it to have this design. Like, no, it's like, I don't have another place to be right now. I need a shelter. I need it to keep me protected from the elements.
You don't start with the in-ground pool. Yeah,
that's right. So yeah, that's my point, is that the closer you are to zero, to having your needs not being met, the more you're going to focus on the basics, the essentials. And the more those are taken care of, then the more you can focus on the aesthetics. That's why I call it expanding aesthetics. So you make the pot, now it holds water. Now I can focus on what I want it to look like. So I want to put some designs on it. Or now that I have a few that are basic, now I can make one that's got some prettier handles and some different kind of things. But I didn't start with that. I started with a very basic kind of shape. And then I did that with my shelter. And then maybe my neighbors do that with their shelters. We form together. So as we all have our shelters, then now we can focus on some aesthetics, since we have the basic needs that are met. And so my point is that the farther removed we are from the mechanisms that are meeting our needs and taking care of us, the more likely we are to forget about what is needed, and perhaps start to make aesthetic changes that come at the expense of the things that are meeting the needs, right? So whenever I'm thinking about like why have celebrity presidents in the first place? Well, if our needs are so well met, so things, the trains are running on time, as they would say, then you're more likely to not focus on competence because you're so removed from like the necessity of it that you can focus on, well, who says, speaks the way that I like the best, whose personality. In other words, personality is way, way, way more important than is even remotely rational for a president, only because their competency isn't as important. It doesn't seem like, or at least we're not treating it like. I should clarify. We aren't treating it like it's important because things are going so well for us. We can, focus on other things, and we're sacrificing competence as a result. Does that make sense? So I think so. Yeah. The competency hierarchy thing, I think, is right, but we have a lot of hierarchies that exist right now that don't do anything. They're not problem-solving hierarchies. They just have influence, just like a president who's elected on personality, but they still get all this power because we already have the power taken care of. The lights come on, the water comes out of the sink, right? I've got internet right now. That's all taken care of. So I'm not focused on someone who's maintaining my lights, my water, and my internet because I just assume it's going to be fine. So we have all these hierarchies and people are getting influenced not based on that because we take it for granted because we're so far removed from absolute zero that we don't think about that. It's relative to us that we can focus on pure aesthetics.
Yeah, I would say it seems like competence, especially when it comes to what the presidential position is now, it's less competence and more what narrative are they building. So now, like, the characteristic of competence is getting taken out of the hierarchy, and the characteristic of narrative is getting put in there as their top valued characteristic. And I think what's important here is, just like news organizations try to sell you all the bad things that are happening because it's just more attractive to watch it. It's more attractive to watch a car accident than it is to watch a butterfly. Like, it's more attractive to just the human brain and what we want to see. The same thing is being caught in our politics. I think the narrative is there to build a sense of oppression. So then they can also give you the kind of hero aspect that there is this oppression here and I'm the hero you need to elect to take care of it, rather than having the competence to say there's probably not a problem here. Guess what? Racism, it's not dead, but it's on life support, kind of the old Thomas Sowell claim. Here are some policies that will make sure that it gets completely eliminated, or make sure that if there is racism in the system, that system won't affect you at all. That's not a sexy sell as building a narrative to say there is a bomb coming our way and only I can deflect this bomb in the other direction.
Yep.
The world is ending. Climate change, I think, is one of these big things, although it's not something I completely deny, but it's certainly used in a narrative format to say climate change is coming and you must elect me because the other guy's not taking care of it. The other guy will not help in this instance. So it has nothing to do with competence. Like, what's Joe Biden going to do that's going to stop climate change that Trump won't? All he does is point out and highlight that it's there. And then he can say Green New Deal, blah, 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 whatever stuff. That's not a real, that's not a set of policies. That's just highlighting a problem that you want to highlight. And again, use a hero complex and say, I'm the hero you need. Whereas the competent person, and you bring it up, the competence kind of ebbs and flows. And that's why you see Republicans get voted in when we're in wartime, because it's like, okay, the guy who's a war hawk might be best if we're at a time of war. And, once things start getting easier, that's where the kind of celebrity, I guess, would come in. The people person, the guy who's just seems like he would be an awesome representation of America to the outside world. And that's why they get elected. So I think it's that ebb and flow of competence and narrative, or even aesthetics, but I think a narrative plays a large role in there. Well, it plays a larger role now, I would say, because narrative can be amplified in so many different mediums.
Yep.
That building that narrative to say, you must elect me to fix X problem, is how we're electing these people and how they jump to the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So let's try to crystallize, because we're at about the 90-minute mark here. So let's try and crystallize a little bit of so like we said at the beginning, this is probably introducing people to an idea that's a worthy idea, and it's worth, like, I don't think we wasted one second here. So it's a worthy idea because of the implications. So the idea we're trying to put in front of people is, look, so hierarchies, you hear this thing and you maybe think of like Maslow's hierarchy of values or hierarchy of needs, which an interesting thing about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom, the ones that come first, are all physical, and the ones that come after are what you would maybe say are aesthetic or not, are intangible. So his thing totally goes in. I researched it when I was thinking about like the needs versus aesthetics. And I'm like, oh, this makes sense. So as you get these met, then you can focus on, how do I feel about me today? Anyway, so we're saying that, look, hierarchies are a natural thing. They arise in terms of human relationships. They arise with problems usually. So a problem, here's a problem. We need a solution. We solve problems better as a collective. And so we band together to solve the problem. And then whoever, contributes most, they'll get more of the spoils, right? So Patrick Mahomes, his deal for the Chiefs is he's making more than the average player for the Chiefs because he's the quarterback.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, dude, I'm cool with it. So anyway, but the point is then as that happens, there are people at the top who are identifiable by their spoils and by their competency and how they're treated societally as a result of being a competent person with the most spoils. And then there are people at the bottom. And then as you play that game over and over and over and over and over again in a society, you start to have stratification of people who are more towards the top of the hierarchy and people that are more towards the bottom of the hierarchy. And that basically, because there's a aspect of obtaining spoils, clout, wealth, influence, power, whatever, the hierarchies, and because humans suck as a general rule, hierarchies have a propensity to bend towards corruption, to bend towards rigidity, and that there are people like that might begin to play a game, as Peterson says, that's inappropriately oriented towards power more than problem solving, more than contribution to the society as a whole. And so there are people who are interested in primarily maintaining the hierarchy, who say hierarchies are good, they solve problems, they're a necessary function of society. Like we wouldn't have electricity without these things. And then there are other people who are typically, they're outside or kind of maybe on the periphery or operating within it, but either way, who their function is to point out when the hierarchy becomes rigid and whenever it starts to bend towards corruption and whenever it's no longer benefiting everyone who is part of it and it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, so that the hierarchy can change so that it begins to function in a way that isn't bent towards corruption or rigidity, and it starts to kind of resume the place that it started as, which is just meeting the needs of people and then the spoils and stuff. And so then it kind of, the cycle begins again. And so the case that we've kind of been talking about here is historically in the West is that there are people on the ideological right who, as Haidt writes about, have a mind more towards problem solution, more like a practical functionality of things. And so they have a higher or more likely orientation towards wanting to maintain hierarchies because they see them as necessary functions that solve problems. And then there is people on the left who are more open to experience, who are more in tune with reciprocity and equality and all these different things, that they are more keenly able to point out when a hierarchy becomes corrupt and the dispossessed at the bottom aren't being taken care of. And so they traditionally serve the role of saying, hey, the hierarchy is becoming corrupt. And again, they might be in the hierarchy, but they serve the role of pointing out when the hierarchy becomes corrupt and providing a feedback mechanism to what the hierarchy is doing so that it can change and reorient and recalibrate what it's doing and move away from that corruption and rigidity back to its original purpose and function. And so that's where the right traditionally occupied, and that's where the left traditionally occupied. And then we're saying that they switched at some point, and that was a gradual thing. I think you're totally right, that there were some ways in which they changed in the education system once they infiltrated there. And I would say in terms of influencing the broader society with moral legitimacy, or at least what I would say is a perception of moral legitimacy that probably took place, I think, somewhere in the 90s. And that once you have that, once you occupy that space and all of society views you and your general idea set as the good guys, it's very difficult for anyone outside of that to assail it unless you do something so fundamentally corrupting, or you have a system, which is what I think we're seeing now, is that it is so astute and so good at maintaining your power through intimidation and through a series of incrementally developed social pressures, that even if you do things that are corrupting and harmful for society, you make it difficult for there to be any feedback. But the point is that the right and the left switched, whether it's, some part of it in education, maybe societally in the 90s, but where the left is now occupying the hierarchies and the institutions and the systems, and the right is now, at least they should be, the role that they're in would be the one, if you say, well, the left is now controlling the hierarchy and it's bending towards rigidity and corruption, that the right, if they're doing the other thing that has been done historically, is supposed to be performing the role of pointing out corruption and rigidity in the hierarchy so that it bends back towards helping everyone and performing its prior role. But that's not really what we're seeing today. But we've just been kind of trying to introduce that idea of, here's how hierarchies are formed, here's what they've looked like in the West, here's the different roles that they play, and here's kind of where maybe the situation is today and a little bit of how we got here. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. And as you're saying that, I was thinking of a new thing, and it's not something we're going to be able to unpack now because we've been on for a long time. But the graphic you originally had up with the hierarchy triangle, it's normally how they're represented, where the dispossessed are going to be on the bottom, the beneficiaries, the main beneficiaries are going to be on the top, normally due to confidence. Well, since you have this narrative, it's actually flipped, where the dispossessed, I'd say dispossessed, are on the top. Those people who claim to not hold power, but actually hold the power. Dispossessed are on the top. The beneficiaries are now on the bottom. They force the people who are benefiting from the system toward the bottom. That's why Starbucks comes out and say, I'm pretty sure, been explicit about, like, we don't want to keep participating in that, like, a more capitalist system, even though they are the main beneficiaries of that system. So they're like saying, we're claiming we're on the bottom, like, don't worry about us, we're on the bottom, and the beneficiaries on the top. But it's like a branding thing that the people, that you have to keep the followers thinking that they are the ones who are dispossessed. You have to keep them thinking that they're the ones speaking truth to power, even though they don't realize that they're the ones who have the power. And you have a couple people pulling, behind the curtain that are operating those systems that realize that they're in a place of power, but they're trying to force the beneficiaries of the hierarchy toward the bottom. So I think we're having a complete inversion of this hierarchical structure, but it's the people operating the dispossessed who are continuing the narrative with the followers who believe, again, they're speaking truth to power. That's the way I'm starting to see it now.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we never put the image up, but I think you probably described it fine. Though I think that so now that we've kind of painted this picture, I think that the next part that we probably maybe want to spend the last bit on is, and you hinted at it a little bit whenever we talked about that kind of Overton asymmetry, that and whenever I talked about like, okay, well, power being a problem is only a function of how that power is wielded, right? So Frodo has the ring of power, takes it and throws it in the volcano, right? So he had that power the whole time, but was it really a problem? Well, in the end, no, right? In the end, no. So power, the problem of power is really a problem of the character of those who wield it. So let's spend this last little bit, unless you have a thing that you think is more pressing, which I'm open to. It's not rhetorical, but
No,
talking about the problem of the hierarchy switch. So in the graphic that I made on my phone, right, I had a square, and inside that square was a triangle that represented the hierarchy, and then there was, you know, kind of the people who were criticizing it and the people that are benefiting and stuff. But the square was it served a purpose. The square that all of that action was taking place inside of served a purpose. So let's unpack that a little bit with, you know, so we have all these games being played, all these different hierarchies, all these different people rising, falling, criticizing, you know, resisting, acquiescing, whatever. But it's all taking place inside of a framework, right? Inside of a agreed upon set of rules. So we talked about the West, right? At the beginning of how does this metaphor even make sense? Well, we're talking about what Western values and culture and philosophy. So let's talk about the framework that we're operating in, where all of these various things took place historically, and the problem of what is taking place now in relation to that framework. Like what do you see that framework as, and what do you see the problem as? So of course, you know what my thoughts are on this, but I want to hear what you think here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that framework in there, you have to, you're operating inside of it when you're operating inside these hierarchies, whether you accept it or not. So it's kind of, even though the claims of some of these people are to deny some of the principles that they're working inside of, like individual liberty, and some of just like the founding principles that they completely reject because the founders were all racist. So obviously everything they said could not be true. We're still working within that framework and still working within that belief system that are helping them go to the top. And then what I think they're trying to do is kind of puncture their way out. So I don't really know if what they claim is actually what they're going to try to do to try to make this homogeneous belief system. I mean, I believe they want that, but the individual liberty part, you know, is something that, you know, maybe the followers want who don't believe they have the power. Maybe they want that, but the people at the top are like, I don't want individual liberty for you guys, but I want it for me. I want to still maintain my spot on top, right? So they're still working within the square. They're still working within that guiding principle that we're kind of born with, almost inherent in America. I mean, it's just something that just comes with it. And we talked about it before, how it's kind of, you know, what I said is like it's an atheist arguing against religion in America, where there are some of the founding principles the atheist is using are actually principles founded in Judeo-Christian tradition. Yep. So they're using those principles to fight and buck against the exact system that created it. So some people are really good at kind of laying out, you know, I think that these religions served a really, really good purpose, and it gave me, you know, this type of reasoning, but now it's time to get rid of it. And then there's the atheists, like it never served a purpose. All it did was lead to death and despair, and we need to get rid of it. But they don't even realize they're using the systems and traditions given from that ideology to get rid of it.
Yep.
So that's kind of like the reverse they're doing. It's like they have to work within the framework, and their claim is to either completely flat out deny the framework or to burst out of it once they get enough power. But I would say as soon as they get the power, I don't know how willing they're going to be to do it, to turn this Western country into, and what's the plan? Do you want it to become Soviet Russia? Do you want it to become all these other places that we know don't work? Maybe some of them do. Maybe some of them don't. I'm not quite sure where they're going with that.
Yeah, I agree. The way I would conceptualize it is, so because one thing that for some reason like popped up in the back of my head, I think is maybe when you brought up Nike or something. It's been kind of simmering in the back of my head since we've been talking, is the role that corporations play in this. And I really think that what will end up happening, so whenever you're saying, I don't know what their goals are, before I even flesh this out, I should probably actually talk about what we were just talking about. So that framework, like you said, is the Western, what you'd say is the Western values, guiding principles, values, assumed realities, assumed rules of the game. So the way that people could even influence the hierarchy and point out criticisms just on a physical, practical level is the fact that they could point out issues, point out corruption. Like, so going back to like the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, any of those things, how were people even able to point out those corruptions? Well, they had the First Amendment. They had the freedom, so they were operating. So even though there were people that were operating corruptly and exploitatively and oppressively in the hierarchy, they still, like, they weren't perfect about it. Like, you know, you got your Bull Connors, right? But there was still you're in an atmosphere where it's assumed that if this guy wants to speak out, he can, right? They can march on Selma and they could do these things because they can. So the point is that the way that even is able to operate is because we all, on some level, have a subconscious or often conscious, for people that really value it, we agree to the rules of the game. We agree to the principles. We agree to the values, like you said. And that's really necessary. So, you know, going back to our football analogy, you know, you have the beginning, you're in the preseason or before even the preseason, where you're doing practice and tryouts and stuff. And there are people competing for, I want to be the starting tailback, you know, or whatever, all these different things. People competing, and they're competing according to the rules of the game. And whoever, you know, does the best or makes the best argument or whatever through their skills, you know, gets that spot. What you wouldn't expect is you have three people competing, and then one of them shows up with a gun and shoots the other two in the face, and people go, oh, well, I guess you have the spot. Like, that's not part of the rules of the system, and so that wouldn't work, right? And so that's the point, is that all this talk about hierarchies, people rising, people falling, people criticizing, people resisting, whatever, exists within a greater framework of Western values, of freedom of speech, individual liberty, the ability to alienate your own labor, the ability to freedom of association, all these different things. And so the problem is that we have, like you said, they're trying to puncture, you know, you said, I don't really know what their goals are. Well, the problem is, well, their goals are power, one, and two, that wouldn't so much be a bad thing if they weren't also trying to change that system and change the rules of the game to make it to where there is no other mechanism for other people to remove them from power. So I think the corporations thing plays a role in a lot of ways, in that, like, think about whenever in colonial times, whenever a country takes over another, think about the Soviet Union, right? They would take over a country and then they'd put a puppet leader in. So they'd have this vassal state. They'd have a puppet leader who ran it. And really, they were just another arm of the Soviet Union, right? So you have like Ukraine or something. And the people in charge, the president, you know, at the time, is answering to the Soviet Union, or answering to Russia. But he's, you know, the president of that place, and he gets to live in the palace. He gets to, you know, as long as he obeys the pecking orders that are brought down to him and he keeps, you know, revolution from happening, then he gets to maintain his position of power. What do you think the heads of these corporations are thinking? They're like, yeah, we'll do the things. We just want to keep our spot at the table. And well, who ends up, you know, losing in the long run is the people on the ground, you know? So I'm not, obviously that's not a perfect metaphor, but I think that the point is there are people who want to maintain their power, so they will go along with whatever the occupying force seems to be trying to put on them. So that they're like, yeah, we'll change our Instagram to this thing. That's fine. You know, just, I want to keep making, you know, $17 million a year, whatever it is, you know, that some of these CEOs and stuff. are making. That's actually probably in the low end. So, but that's what I think the goal is. And so the problem that we've kind of been introducing here, again, I think this is important, is for people to recognize it's not just we have some crazy societal thing happening. Like, things are nuts, guys. Like, everyone knows things are nuts. Things are going to be nuts. Like, that's okay, I guess, as long as the people that are nuts don't have a lot of power. Like, why am I not up at night worried about the KKK? Okay, it's not because I'm a white dude. It's because they don't have any freaking power. If the KKK all of a sudden was running CNN and running and having influence on all these major companies, I'd go, KKK is a problem, guys. We need to do something here, okay? Because these nut jobs are crazy. They have a really dystopian, distorted, perverse vision for our country. We need to do something. So I'm not as worried about them because they don't have any power. But we have people that have similarly perverse and malicious goals and intentions that are totally extractive and totally manipulative for our country. And they're, like you said, they're operating within the system because they can, because it's a good system. But as I think Ruben points out sometimes, is that some liberalism is the downfall of liberalism. Like, in other words, if you give everyone freedom, you kind of have to, but at the same time, you're letting the crazy speak. And so if you don't have a virtuous society that is going to go, that kind of has a good immune system to evil that can force it out, then they're going to be taken over. They're going to have these weird social pathologies that are going to gain ascendancy. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's the exact same as if the KKK or some other crazy group gained ascendancy, because we don't have a good immune system to it, because they played a really good long game. They're incredibly manipulative. Like, you have to respect the hell out of them, their strategies, respect them as opponents. That's why that graphic the other day that was posted, that was in the Smithsonian's thing, I'm like, don't dismiss this. Yeah, it's evil. Yeah, it's wrong. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But this is carefully crafted. We have to respect the points and implications it's making. We can't dismiss it for a second, because there was a lot of thought that went into this, in other words. And so we have to put as much thought into how we push back against it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just using the power within the system to take down the system it's reminded me of a quote that I don't even remember who quoted or who said this, but it's like a thought that stops thought is the only thought that ought to be stopped, kind of thing. It's like you're in the system. That's the freedom of speech thing. It's like, we want freedom of speech, but the only bad freedom of speech, and that's why, people who are banging on doors as these speakers are trying to speak in college campuses are like, well, I'm using my freedom of speech. And it's like, well, no, you're using your speech to shut down other speech. Right. And that's the only speech that ought to be stopped.
Yep.
And that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, I have my free speech here. I'm just doing my thing. But then once you gave power, it's like, well, I'm going to use my speech to make sure you're not allowed to speak anymore. Yep. And so that's what I mean by their end goals. Is their end goals to take away the First Amendment, or are their end goals to manipulate the First Amendment so much that it's only going to cater to their wants? Are they going to say free speech except for hate speech? That's going to be amended onto there now. And then they're going to amend other things onto there now that are going to weaponize these things? Or are they just going to hold cloth to say it's gone?
Well, no. So it's a distinction without a difference, right? So if you keep the First Amendment, but you have people in power that interpret it in such a restrictive way that it no longer resembles what it used to resemble, it's the same as removing it, right? Like, if you remove it and replace it with something perverse and bad, it's the same as just redefining it into something perverse and bad. The end result's the same. So I'm not sure they even have a preference. I think I don't want to be so dismissive to say that they don't know. And by they, and this is, man, that's actually a whole other topic. The point is that the people who are in charge of this and who are thinking about these things, I think that they do have a preference, which is, so going back to Hayek, when he talks about, well, you don't just bring in new words, you hijack the language, you redefine things, because people have already bought into it. So you redefine words and then say, aren't you in support of X? And then people say yes, and then they don't know what they just signed on to.
Well, Black Lives Matter. That's a perfect exactly representation
right.
of that.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's brilliant branding. And so it's like, well, if you don't support, I mean, think about what happened whenever the president said that it was divisive or a hate thing, is then the legacy media said he called the phrase Black Lives Matter
the idea, not Black Lives Matter Inc.
As if that it's so completely disconnected from but you know what I mean? And so that's what I'm saying. I think that they're just going to continue to manipulate the language, and they'll just alter it, and they'll use a series of, they'll use the courts as the thing that they want to use to reinterpret it to mean certain things. And that's why you see such a push for speech is violence, is because speech is speech. Okay. But if you get enough people to even 1% buy into the idea that speech is violence, in a way that you get to define, right? Well, then now you have a legal framework for opposing certain speech that you get to define as speech. I forget who it was. It was a conservative, but someone said, "Why are you so opposed?" It was one of those college campus things, right? And they're like, "Why are you so opposed to restricting hate speech?" And he said, "I'll let you restrict hate speech as long as I get to define what it is. If you get to restrict it and define it, now we have a problem." And so I think that's just what they're going to do with that, is remove speech. I think that they'll do that before. I mean, the founders in our amendments, they really laid out the amendments really in order of importance, quite obviously. And the first two are really the foundational ones. I think even in the first five is not, soldiers can't be quartered in your home, so those are a little bit more, but that gives you a right to some type of privacy and to control your own property. But the point is that those are a little bit more, you say, okay, I understand that in the scope of the historical context. These first two, where they're saying there is no revolution, there is no ability to fight a tyrannical power without these things. You have the first one, and if that fails, that's why you have the second one, to enforce the first one, and to give a little bit of teeth to the first one. And so I think that that's why speech is the thing that they're attacking. Speech, and they do have issues with guns, and they try to pass a lot of gun legislation, but they're not as concerned with that, because if you remove people's ability to oppose your gun legislation and all these other things, then you can pass it. So that's kind of the key. You open that door to restricting and policing, and you get people to police themselves. That's where you get into kind of some of that walking on eggshells, that abusive environment stuff, that obviously we'll get into later. But once people are policing themselves, then you can do whatever the hell you want, because who's going to stop you? You've made it to where they're no longer, they lack the will and the confidence.
The autonomy to do anything.
Yeah, that's exactly right. To try and resist you. But you have to do the speech first. And that's what we're seeing right now, is we have the hierarchies have switched. The people who would normally, or who should be able to criticize the hierarchy, as you said, the ones who have taken control are changing the rules of the game. So it's that tailback who's like, comes in, shoots the people he's competing with for the starting position, and they're like, "You can't do that." And he's like, "No, I changed the rules. Go ask, what's his name? Roger Goodell. Like, go ask." Yeah, no, it's in the rules. Or they point the gun at them, and I can't do what? You know what I mean? And so they're changing the rules behind them. So they're seizing power, and then they're shutting the door and removing that framework, or assaulting the legitimacy of that framework by changing reality. That's that gaslighting, that's that manipulation, all that other stuff, so that now we don't have the same access to mechanisms to criticize the newly corrupted hierarchy. And that's the situation we're in now, that we're trying to tell people is hierarchies have shifted. Here's where that's happened. How do we define this? And also, it's not the same as it's ever been historically. This isn't like the civil rights movement, where even though there was massive resistance, I mean, what do you call bombing churches, right? That's resistance. That's societal resistance. But it wasn't decisive resistance, right? What we're looking at now could be decisive resistance, in terms of the consequences of it. I would argue. And so that's the difference. It's not that there's not been resistance in the past. It's that it wasn't necessarily systemic, although it was in the form of like Jim Crow, again, it's just a really good analogy. Jim Crow was a system that was being oppressed, but it was being oppressed by the rules of the system that put it in place. And so like that's what we're having right now is people that are wanting to that are gaining power, implementing systems, and some unofficial, and it's becoming official as we're getting these new, the moral arbiters infiltrating companies and governmental structures. But then they're also making it so that you cannot fight it within the system, like Martin Luther King was able to do. Does that make sense? So does that sound right? Does that sound like a good summary of kind of the idea we're trying to introduce to people? Is there anything you would add there? I only have one other thought, but it's basically a bookending thought. So is there anything you would add to that?
No, it's certainly a more clear way to identify what's happening. And, we can talk about all this and, basically it's just fun to have this intellectual game, but more so now than ever, I mean, you really got to pay attention to what's happening and understand when is the gun being turned on me? What am I being told? Because you said, or like you said, they're trying to control your speech. They're not even trying to do that, or they're not only trying to do that. They're telling you now that if you're silent, you're now being aggressive, or you're being you're harming people. Like, it's dangerous. Like that's insane. The lack of speaking is now becoming weaponized. So you talk about changing the rules, especially when you say like white silence is violence. Well, now they're changing that specific rule, and they're defining that rule, saying, well, if you have a certain skin color now and you don't speak up, you are now the anti-ally. You're the enemy, and that is what happens on the what I would say macro level. If that becomes the norm, I mean, that's going to be irreputable, or it would be damaging, and it's not going to be easy to come back from that.
Yep. So yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, the point is, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. So if we told people, so another way of saying the hierarchy has changed is, so go to Die Hard, right? You've got Joseph Takagi, that's his name, and who's the head of the Nakatomi Corporation. And they're at the Christmas party. Hans Gruber comes in. We now have a hierarchy shift, right? Takagi's not running the party anymore. Hans Gruber is. So what we're trying to tell people is, it's not just that there has been a hierarchy change here, right? That there is a qualitative difference in the people who are now in control of the hierarchy, and in their goals and their tactics and what they're doing, and that they are making it so that inaction is not an option, right? So for a while, you're Holly and you're Ellis and you're everyone else sitting down, hoping to just get through it. But eventually they're going to force you up on the roof that's rigged with explosives. So to what you were just saying, silence is violence, white silence is violence. Inaction is increasingly becoming a non-option. So in other words, you're going to be put into a position where you have to kind of do something, right? And, we're not trying to be alarmist or hyperbolic. I so detest, the heightened rhetoric of crisis. Everything's a crisis. Every election's the most important one. Also, there's stuff I very much detest that. And that's why I've been super resistant to that kind of rhetoric in any of my content, because of that. Because I'm like, hey, let's just treat each other better. Let's just be reasonable and all this other stuff. But as we're seeing this stuff manifest, and as we're seeing like it kind of crystallize, like the outlines are forming on things that we can point at now. It's no longer kind of a general feeling or a general sense of things. It's starting to crystallize, and the end game, as you might call it, is starting to be enacted. It's starting, like, we're in a different stage now of what's going on in the culture wars broadly than we were 3 years ago. Like, just 100% we are. In terms of, the ground. So if we're thinking about like an actual battle or an actual war, the lines have shifted, there are different boundaries being drawn, and there are some people that have gained more ground and some people that have lost ground. And so as we're seeing that kind of crystallize a little bit and seeing the implications of it, then it's important that we at least lay this framework for people of the hierarchies have changed, and the people who are now currently in charge are trying to change the rules. They're trying to make it to where, yeah, I can bring a gun on the field, I can kill my competition, and what are you going to do about it? Oh, I'm going to make you so afraid that you're not even going to try and stop me. You're going to silence yourself, and you're going to silence the guy next to you, who might say something. But that's a whole nother thing. So it's a corrupt hierarchy, and I'm thinking next time we can get into what specifically does it look like. So we've made a case here. We've made some claims that I feel like we've done a good job of substantiating, but maybe we can add a little bit more practicality to it. We've touched on a little bit with some of the stuff for corporations. You're talking about like your friend on Facebook and stuff like that. But maybe we can, next time we talk, flesh a little bit of that out of, okay, so let's talk about a corrupt hierarchy. Are there examples of corrupt hierarchies we can use to lay up next to this and say, does this look like this, right? How does this look different than times when the hierarchy has been corrupted in the past? Again, I think we could look at, what did the Jim Crow South look like? How did it change? What would it look like if it was, governed the same way as this hierarchy is seeking to govern? So things like that, like where we can flesh out the exact characteristics of a corrupt hierarchy, how they function, how people within them function, and how they feel, and what is that, like, what are the effects? How would you know? In other words, how would you know if you were being subordinated, or if you were subordinating yourself to a corrupt hierarchy? Like, what would that feel like? That's kind of what I'm thinking about for next time. I don't know what your thoughts are on anything I just said, but
I think it's a great idea, and together we will solve all the world's problems.
We got this guy. Not sure. He's going to solve all our problems.
We do need more whiskey, but
yeah, that's right.
We'll get through it.
I totally.
It's a great idea, though.
So I had a little bit in my cap, and I had my bottle upside down, and I tried to open it earlier. I don't know if you heard it, but for some reason it was like way more than I thought, and I like my hand. See how glistening it is? It's covered in whiskey. It's like super sticky. I've had like whiskey on me this whole time. I was like, bummer, because I definitely would have had like maybe like half a shot left. Anyway, okay. So we'll call it there, and then we'll continue this conversation. Hopefully sometime in the near future. I think it's really important. This is kind of the thing that I'm thinking about most right now, especially as we're thinking about practical things. So we're thinking about government, thinking about the election. But so I want to put this, we've talked about this before, whenever we're thinking about stuff we wanted to talk about. Like, there's definitely a place for this, framing this within the context of the election. But in no way do I think it, is the thing of the election. This is a societal thing. This is a long game that's been played for a while. So it's not going to be solved with an election. But there are some ways we can understand this that I think are really useful. So anyway, we'll continue this in the near future. So Kevin he's the host of the Engineering Politics podcast. It's a super great podcast on conservatism. He gives his thoughts on pop culture lately. He's been doing some more current event stuff in the EP zone. That's pretty cool that his subscribers at his locals page get access to. And I believe you have a promo code for that. Is that correct, Kevin? You want to plug your locals?
I do. Promo code EPFREE, EPFREE. It will give you 3 months free access to it. And now, kind of like you mentioned before, I have a couple new subscriber-only features that include some bonus content now at the end of the podcasts, and also the EP zone, which is going to be kind of more of an informal, rant where I'm going to go over current events. So I did the first one. It was kind of fun. Got to sure up some of the different things that I want to do. I had a rapid fire section at the end where I'm like, I'm going to go through this stuff really fast. And I spent like 20 minutes on every subject, it felt like. So I failed totally at that, but getting better at it. So yeah, you can find that on engineeringpolitics.locals.com.
Cool. I will also say, so I would definitely take advantage of the promo code, because I listened to the one that you had where the bonus content on the Barry Weiss's resignation letter, and dude, all of the content was in the second part of it. So people, you gotta seriously sign up for that part. Mm-hmm. And you did a good job, because I was like, man, if I wasn't part of the second part, I would be like, oh man, I missed out on everything. So that was good. So take advantage of that promo code, folks, on his locals. So you can go to, and also on Twitter, that's at Engineering Politics, right? You have your own website, engineeringpolitics.com. You're on ThinkSpot as well, Engineering Politics there. And YouTube, Engineering Politics, is where a lot of your free non-subscriber content is going to be as well. Is that correct?
Say Engineering Politics on basically everything except for Twitter is ENG_politics.
Okay, that's
not English politics. The funny thing about Twitter too is I have way less followers on Twitter than I have on locals. Yeah. So I'm trying to bump up the Twitter numbers, but I really don't go on there all that much. But Parler's another spot where you can find me too. I've
been meaning to make a Parler. I just haven't yet. I've been meaning to do a lot of things, right? Everyone's always meaning to do stuff. We suck at doing the things we mean to do, right? Anyway, that's right. So yeah, it's the same. So on locals, the same. That's where you find Kevin stuff, Engineering Politics. I'd highly recommend it. He's got a really good, fresh, and digestible conservative, explanation for things, and he goes a lot into history and philosophical stuff. So I'd highly recommend that. This is the kind of thing you're into. Please follow me at Return to Reason. That's on YouTube, Return to Reason. My locals is returntoreason.locals.com. On Twitter, that's at My Mundane Mind. You can get on ThinkSpot. I also am on there, Return to Reason. And same on Medium. I upload a lot of my articles to Medium. I'm going to be putting this series out on emotional abuse, which is the thing that we'll get into next time, of abusive atmospheres and how that might be something we might be experiencing, that might explain some of the effects, or maybe categorize some of the effects of corrupt hierarchies as kind of an abusive atmosphere. So please check all that out. I appreciate you guys watching. Kevin, is there anything else that you can think of?
No, man, it's good. I like man, you got through Frodo and stuff. I've never seen that episode of Battlestar Galactica before, but
me neither. That's right. That's where Dumbledore is trying to get
yes.
Was it? Yeah, trying to get the ring to Mordor.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Thanks everyone for watching. Kevin, I'm going to stop recording now, and that's it. See you guys next time. Peace.
See ya. All right, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Make sure to join the Return to Reason Locals community and show Truman some support. You can go to returntoreason.locals.com to support his locals community, and you can also find him on ThinkSpot and YouTube by searching Return to Reason. And you can also find him on Twitter at MyMundaneMind. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to take a quick moment to share different ways you can help support this content. There are a few easy ways to do this. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can give me a follow on Parler at Engineering Politics. You can join the Facebook group named Engineering Politics, where I share and discuss content with the Facebook community. You can also subscribe to my video channel on YouTube under the channel name Engineering Politics, where you can find the video version of each podcast. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging the trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can find all of my podcasts and videos on there as well. But the best way to interact with me, get the newest content, and support this podcast is the Engineering Politics Locals community. This is an amazing community that goes far beyond just a membership platform intermediary for creators. It allows followers of this content to get together and discuss the newest articles, podcasts, and videos all in one place. I strongly urge you to join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a subscriber if you use promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. Monthly subscriptions to the Engineering Politics Locals community start as low as $2 per month. So I hope I can count on your support so I can start making higher quality podcasts and subscriber content like the bonus content at the end of most shows, and the new video series, the EP Zone, available only in the Engineering Politics Locals community with a subscription pass. I appreciate your consideration. Let's build a community together. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.